The scent of salt and blood clung to the wind as Captain Dorian Vane stepped onto the deck of the captured smuggling ship. The Storm Vulture groaned under the weight of its secrets, its timbers slick with seawater and spilled rum. The battle had been brief. Dorian's crew had descended like a storm, blades flashing, muskets roaring. Now, the enemy lay bound, their ship his prize. But there was no gold, no treasure chests brimming with stolen riches. Only cages. Dorian's sharp, sea-gray eyes scanned the iron bars, his pulse quickening. Within them, something moved, something alive. A soft glow, like the shimmer of moonlight on water, pulsed from within the prison. As he stepped closer, the glow resolved into bodies, slick and glistening, their shapes half hidden in the shadows. Mermaids. They were unlike anything he had ever seen. Scales that gleamed like polished pearls, gills fluttering in the lantern light, long strands of hair flowing like seaweed caught in the tide. Some were unconscious, their breathing weak, their tails curled against the cold iron. Others watched him with unblinking eyes filled with terror. And then there was her. At the center of the largest cage, shackled with cruel, rusted chains, sat a mermaid unlike the rest. Seraphine. Her tail was silver blue, shifting colors like a storm-touched sea, and her skin, pale as seafoam, wore delicate bioluminescent markings that pulsed in rhythm with her breath. Her eyes, twin whirlpools of green and gold, locked onto his, unafraid. Dorian felt the weight of that gaze settle over him like an anchor dragging him down. She was not merely beautiful, she was otherworldly. Behind him, the first mate, Talon Graves, let out a low whistle. "By the abyss, Captain, this ain't just any cargo." "Aye," Dorian murmured, fingers curling around the hilt of his cutlass. "Slaves, smuggled for some wretched buyer." He had dealt in many dark trades, but this felt wrong. A cough from one of the captured smugglers interrupted his thoughts. Dorian turned sharply, boots slamming against the soaked deck. He grabbed the nearest man by the collar, hauling him upright. The smuggler, young, sunburned, and trembling, looked ready to spill his guts from fear alone. "Who were they for?" Dorian demanded. The man swallowed hard. "T, the governor of the Eastern Isles. H, he pays for 'em. Special ones like her. Worth a bloody fortune." Dorian's grip tightened, rage bubbling beneath his skin. He knew of Lord Kerrigan Drell, the so-called governor, a man who fancied himself ruler of the sea but had the heart of a leech. Dorian had robbed many, but he had never trafficked in flesh. He may have been a pirate, but he had his own laws. A soft sound pulled his attention back to the cage. Seraphine was singing. It was barely a whisper, but it touched the air like mist, creeping into his bones, curling around his thoughts. Not words, not quite, but sorrow, longing, a plea. It wove into his heartbeat, as if the ocean itself had taken voice. The crew shifted uncomfortably. "Captain," Talon said wearily, "what do we do with them?" Dorian stared at Seraphine. She did not beg. She did not cower. She simply waited. His crew expected him to sell them. He could hear it in their silence, feel it in their greedy stares, a prize beyond measure. Dorian Vane had built his legend on ruthless choices, but as Seraphine's haunting song wrapped around his soul, he knew this was no simple decision. For the first time in his life, the pirate did not know what to do. The night sky above Blacktide Cay was a blanket of storm clouds, dark and brooding. The sea around the pirate haven roared with the fury of an approaching squall, the waves smashing against the jagged rocks like an angry beast. In the distance, the faint glow of lanterns flickered, a sign of the rough settlement that lay hidden behind the cliffs. The island was a sanctuary for pirates, smugglers, and outcasts. Yet tonight, it felt like a place of dark omen. Dorian Vane stood at the edge of the ship's deck, staring into the horizon, the wind howling through his coat, his long dark hair whipping around his face. The weight of the decision gnawed at him. He had taken the mermaids. Seraphine among them, aboard the Tempest's fury, and sailed here, seeking answers. But what answers could a pirate find for creatures of the deep? The mermaids had been locked in the brig, hidden from sight. Dorian had been unable to leave them unattended, not after the look in Seraphine's eyes. Eyes that held secrets older than the stars themselves. Something was stirring in him, something he couldn't explain. It was more than just pity, more than just the thrill of a new treasure. His thoughts were interrupted by the unmistakable shuffle of boots behind him. He turned to see Talon Graves, his first mate, walking toward him with a glint of concern in his eyes. "Captain," Talon began, his voice low, "there's word from the island. The merchant lord's men. They're already here. They're searching the docks. They're looking for the mermaids." Dorian's jaw tightened. Lord Kerrigan Drell, the merchant lord of the Eastern Isles, had spies everywhere. The men were likely already closing in on Blacktide Cay, preparing to claim the mermaids as their property. "I didn't sign up for this," Talon muttered, running a hand through his graying beard. "We could make a small fortune off their sale. Aye, but not if we end up dead in the process." "We're not selling them, Talon," Dorian replied sharply, his voice cutting through the wind like a blade. "Not like cattle." Talon didn't argue, but his gaze lingered on Dorian, uncertainty clouding his features. "A pirate's life ain't so simple anymore, is it, Captain?" Before Dorian could respond, Seraphine's voice floated across the deck, soft and haunting, like the sound of water lapping against a lonely shore. It was a melody unlike any other, a song that made the very air tremble with an otherworldly resonance. The song seemed to call to something inside him, something ancient, primal. "Captain," Talon said in a hushed tone, "you've heard it too, haven't you?" Dorian nodded, his gaze drawn toward the brig. There, Seraphine stood at the bars, her silvery blue tail coiled around her like a serpent. She was watching him with those glowing eyes, eyes that seemed to pull him into another world, one of depths far beyond the surface of the sea. Her long hair floated gently around her like seaweed drifting in an ocean current. For a moment, it felt like the world had paused, and it was only the two of them, the pirate and the mermaid, standing at the edge of an ocean they both couldn't fully understand. Talon followed Dorian's gaze, frowning. "You're making a dangerous choice, Captain. There's something about her, something I can't place. You're tangled in something far worse than any treasure." Dorian didn't look away from Seraphine. There was a stillness in the air, a weight that pressed against his chest. "I don't think I can turn back now." Talon sighed deeply and stepped back, leaving Dorian to his thoughts. The wind picked up, and for a brief moment, the sky seemed to crack open with the first hint of the coming storm. Dorian could feel the pressure rising, not just from the heavens above, but from within himself. The pull of Seraphine's presence was more than a mere fascination. It was as if the sea itself had reached out and claimed him, drawing him into its depths. Seraphine's song grew louder, more urgent. It was a cry of longing, of despair, a song that carried the weight of centuries of oceanic history, of kingdoms lost beneath the waves. She had been born from the sea's deepest heart, and now, it seemed, the sea was calling her home. But was it too late? The distant rumble of thunder echoed across the sky, a reminder of the power that stirred beneath the surface. The pirates at Blacktide Cay would not wait much longer. Dorian had to act. But what was he to do with a creature like Seraphine, with a power like hers? He looked back at her, his heart pounding, the curse of the sea tightening around him. She was not just a mermaid. She was something else, something he couldn't yet comprehend. And as he locked eyes with her once more, Dorian felt an undeniable truth settle deep within his soul. He was no longer just a pirate. He was something far more dangerous. And for better or for worse, he was bound to her, just as she was bound to the sea. The sky above Blacktide Cay had darkened further, heavy clouds swirling like a storm brewing deep within the ocean's heart. The air was thick, thick with more than just moisture. The tension between Dorian Vane and his crew was palpable, the weight of the decision before him pressing down like the very waters of the abyss. He paced the deck of the Tempest's fury, his boots slamming with the force of each step. His mind churned like the restless sea, torn between the loyalty to his crew and the undeniable pull of Seraphine. She had changed everything. The mermaid, the tide-born, had stirred something deep within him, something he hadn't known he was capable of feeling. He could still hear the soft melody of her song in his mind, a haunting tune that whispered of the ocean's depths, of lost kingdoms, and a fate far greater than any pirate's treasure. His hand gripped the railing as he stared into the endless dark expanse of the sea. In the distance, the flicker of lanterns from Blacktide Cay illuminated the shore, but there was no warmth in the light. The island felt cold, the wind biting through his coat like a warning. Dorian had sailed through many storms, both physical and moral, but this was different. This was a storm of the heart. Talon Graves, his first mate, approached from behind, his heavy boots dragging in the sand-like gravel of the ship's planks. "Captain," Talon called softly, "the men are restless. They don't understand why you're keeping them locked up below deck. What's the plan?" Dorian didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared out at the restless waves. Seraphine, her silver-blue scales shimmered in his mind's eye, the way the moonlight danced off her pale skin. When she had first looked at him with those deep oceanic eyes, something had snapped in him, something he had not been prepared for. The way her voice had wrapped around his soul, had whispered of the deep, of the sea's eternal mystery. It was not a call to surrender to fate. No, it was a call to join her. "She's not like the rest of them," Dorian muttered, his voice barely a whisper over the howling wind. "She's different." Talon raised an eyebrow. "Different how, Captain?" "She's still a mermaid, still a slave to some lord who'll pay for her, whether she's different or not." Dorian spun around, his face hardening. "You don't understand. She's not just a slave, Talon. She's alive in a way none of us are." His breath was ragged, his chest rising and falling as he fought to steady his emotions. "She carries the weight of something older than this world, something far older than me or you." Talon didn't reply immediately, sensing the depth of his captain's conflict. His voice softened. "I don't know what it is you see in her, Dorian, but these waters we're sailing in, they're treacherous, and not just because of the storm. We're tangled in something bigger than us, and I don't want to see you drown in it." Dorian's gaze flickered toward the brig, where Seraphine had been locked away ever since they had arrived at Blacktide Cay. Her presence had haunted him in every quiet moment. When he closed his eyes, he could hear the sound of her song, the call of the deep, whispering promises of the unknown. A pirate's life was one of freedom, but she was not of this world. As he turned to leave, he caught a flicker of movement near the brig. His heart skipped. There she was. Seraphine stood at the bars of her cage, staring at him with eyes that glowed with an unearthly light. She was not afraid. Her hair, dark as midnight, swirled around her face like seaweed caught in a tide. She was beautiful, more beautiful than anything he had ever seen, but it was not just her looks that pulled at him. It was the quiet strength in her, the certainty in the way she held herself, even in captivity. She said nothing at first, but her eyes spoke louder than words ever could. They called to him. The ocean whispered in those eyes. "Come closer." Dorian's feet moved almost of their own accord. He reached the cage, his breath shallow. For a moment, neither spoke, and the only sound was the crash of the waves against the rocks below. Seraphine tilted her head slightly, studying him, her gaze piercing, almost knowing. "I don't know what I'm doing," Dorian confessed, his voice hoarse. "I don't know how to free you, or if I even can. But I can't just leave you." Seraphine's lips parted, her voice like the distant rumble of thunder. "You already have," she whispered. "You freed me the moment you laid eyes on me." A chill ran through Dorian's spine. He looked into her eyes, and for the first time he understood. She had been waiting for him. The pirate was not the one in control. And yet, Dorian knew, for better or worse. He could not turn back. Seraphine had him in her grasp, as surely as the sea held the shore. The winds of Black Tide Cay had shifted, the air thick with a storm's promise. As Dorian Vane stood at the helm of the tempest's fury, the sea churned beneath him, a reflection of the storm that brewed not just above, but within. His crew moved about the deck in nervous silence, eyes darting to the horizon. The whispers were growing louder, rippling through the ship like the first tremors of a quake. The pirate captain was changing, and none of them knew what to make of it. He had kept Seraphine locked below, hidden away from prying eyes. But she had not been silent. Her song still lingered in the air, a haunting melody that seemed to call to him in his dreams. Even now, with the storm approaching, he felt it, felt her presence deep within him, like the pull of a distant tide, far stronger than any logic or caution. Talon Graves, his first mate, stepped beside him, glancing at Dorian with a mixture of concern and frustration. "The men are restless, Captain. They're starting to wonder if we've made a mistake." Dorian's gaze remained fixed on the darkening sea, the waves crashing against the ship's hull with violent fury. He didn't respond at first, lost in the weight of his thoughts. His mind drifted to Seraphine's eyes, the way they had looked at him with that quiet strength, as if she had known all along that he could not turn away. "She's not like the others," Dorian muttered, more to himself than to Talon. "She's not just some creature of the sea. She's something ancient, something far beyond anything we've known." Talon let out a frustrated sigh. "I don't care how ancient she is, Dorian. We're being hunted. Lord Kerrigan's men are closing in, and we're stuck in the middle of the damned expanse. If we don't act fast, we'll be swallowed by the very sea we've been plundering." A flicker of movement at the edge of his vision caught Dorian's attention. He turned to see a shadow crossing the deck, a figure cloaked in the shadows of the ship. Ronan Draven, the quartermaster, was making his way toward them, his long coat billowing behind him like the sail of a phantom ship. His face was grim, eyes hard with suspicion. "I've spoken with the men," Ronan said, his voice low. "They want answers. They want to know why we're risking everything for a few mermaids. This is no longer about gold. They're talking mutiny, Dorian. If you don't make a decision soon, it won't matter how powerful she is. We'll be fighting our own." Dorian's fists clenched at his sides, his gaze flickering to the distant horizon. Lord Kerrigan, the name itself was like a curse. A man with no honor, a man who believed the seas were his dominion, that every living thing in it was his for the taking. The smugglers who had first brought the mermaids to Black Tide Cay had been fools to think they could bargain with him. The ocean didn't bend to men's will. It never had. But the threat of Kerrigan's fleet was real. The shadow of the governor's wrath hung over them like an impending storm, and Dorian knew that no matter how strong their ship or their crew, the tempest's fury would stand little chance against the ironclads of the Eastern Isles. "We can't outrun them," Dorian said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "But we can't just hand her over either." The creaking of the ship interrupted the heavy silence as Talon moved to Dorian's side. "Then what do we do, Captain? We can't stay hidden forever." Dorian's heart thundered in his chest, his eyes scanning the waves. Seraphine was down below, waiting. She had trusted him, despite the danger, despite everything. In that moment, Dorian knew what he had to do. He spun toward Ronan. "Prepare the crew. We sail into the heart of the expanse. If Kerrigan wants a fight, he'll have one. We fight for the mermaids, and we fight for our lives. The sea has always been my home, and I won't let it be ruled by anyone, not even Kerrigan." Ronan stared at him for a long moment before nodding and turning to relay the order. Talon, too, gave a small nod of agreement, though the tension in his eyes was far from gone. The crew began to move, a new energy filling the air as the ship made ready for the confrontation that loomed on the horizon. The tension was thick, but there was something else there now: determination. No longer was it just about treasure or survival. It was about something deeper, something worth fighting for. Dorian made his way to the break, his steps quick and purposeful. He needed to see her. He needed to know that he wasn't alone in this fight. When he reached the cage, Seraphine was waiting, her eyes locked on his, as if she had been expecting him. The dim lanterns cast shadows across her shimmering scales, her delicate features a mix of strength and sorrow. She looked at him as if she understood the storm inside him, the turmoil of being caught between two worlds. The tempest's fury sailed into the heart of the expanse, its black sails billowing in the wind like the wings of a shadowed bird of prey. The sea around them grew darker, the waves rising like hungry beasts, crashing against the hull of the ship. A storm was building, and with it, a sense of destiny hung heavy in the air. Dorian Vane stood at the wheel, his hands gripped tightly, the steady creaking of the ship under the pressure of the wind almost lost in the sound of the raging sea. His face was set, eyes sharp with determination, but beneath the cool exterior, a storm of his own rage. His thoughts kept returning to Seraphine, locked below deck, waiting for the fight to come. She had trusted him, and now he had to prove himself worthy of that trust. Talon Graves stood beside him, squinting into the thickening fog. "We're making for the heart of the expanse, Captain. If Kerrigan's fleet is anywhere, they'll be here soon." Dorian's gaze never wavered from the dark horizon. "Let them come. We'll give them a fight they'll never forget." The crew moved like shadows across the deck, preparing for what was coming. There was no time for fear, no time for second thoughts. The mermaids, Seraphine most of all, had changed everything for Dorian. The sea had always been his life, his refuge, his livelihood. But now it was something more. It was a battleground. And on this battleground, Seraphine was the weapon. But she was also something else, something more precious than treasure or gold. She was the key to a world Dorian had only glimpsed. As the ship cut through the waves, Dorian felt the pull of the sea in his bones. The tempest's fury was a creature of the deep, built for speed and power. And though it was a pirate ship, it had a life of its own, just like the ocean it sailed upon. But now, the waters felt different. The sea was alive with something else, something old and dangerous. The air crackled with tension as the crew gathered on deck, their faces grim, their hands ready on the weapons they had drawn. The storm above had turned the sky into a boiling cauldron of black and purple clouds, and the sound of thunder echoed like a warning from the heavens. The waves now surged with a violence they hadn't shown before, as though the very ocean was preparing to swallow them whole. Dorian's heart pounded in his chest as he turned to Talon. "Get the men ready. We don't know when they'll strike, but we need to be prepared." Talon gave a quick nod and moved to rally the crew, his steps quick and purposeful. Dorian's mind raced, and for a fleeting moment, his thoughts turned back to Seraphine. She had not spoken much since their brief exchange, but the weight of her words echoed in his mind. The sea speaks of it. It was more than a warning. It was a prophecy. The wind howled as the ship drew closer to the heart of the expanse, where the mist was thick enough to swallow the world. Dorian could feel it now, the pulse of the sea, steady and strong beneath the waves. And then, far in the distance, he saw it, a ship, a black shadow on the horizon, moving swiftly through the water. Dorian's pulse quickened as he recognized the unmistakable shape of Kerrigan's fleet. The flagship, a massive ironclad with red sails, was at the front, its cannons aimed forward. Behind it, smaller ships followed in a tight formation. Talon joined Dorian at the wheel, his eyes narrowed. There they are, Kerrigan's men. They're not wasting any time. Dorian clenched his jaw. The battle was inevitable now. Ready the cannons. We give them no mercy. The crew scrambled into action, preparing for the coming fight. But Dorian's thoughts once again drifted below deck. He could feel the presence of Seraphine there, even though he couldn't see her. He wondered what she was doing now, what she was feeling. Was she afraid? Or was she as ready for this battle as he was? As the two ships closed the gap, the tension on the tempest's fury became almost unbearable. The crew braced for the inevitable clash, the sounds of their hurried preparations drowned by the howling winds and crashing waves. But Dorian stood still, his eyes locked on the approaching fleet. His mind was sharp, his heart was steady. And then, as if on cue, Seraphine's song reached him again, soft, yet powerful. It wasn't just in his ears, it was in his very soul. Her song was a call to the sea, a plea for the storm to rise, for the tides to turn in their favor. Dorian's heart skipped a beat. It was as if she was with him, standing beside him, her power flowing through him. The ocean was her ally, and now it would be his too. The first cannon roared, sending a blast of fury toward Kerrigan's fleet. The Tempest's fury shook under the blast, but the ship held firm, its crew now fully awake to the storm ahead. This was it. The battle for the sea, for Seraphine, for freedom, was about to begin. And Dorian would not back down. The Tempest's fury rocked violently as the first barrage of cannonballs from Kerrigan's fleet exploded against its sides. The ship groaned and creaked under the pressure, but it held together. Its dark hull cut through the waves with relentless determination. The battle had begun, and every pirate aboard knew that there would be no turning back now. Dorian Vane stood at the helm, his face lit by the flash of gunpowder and the crackle of thunder from above. His heart was steady, but his blood was alive with the thrill of battle. The sea around them had come alive, churning with fury, as if the very waters were at war with the invaders. The wind screamed through the sails, and the rain began to fall in sheets, as though the heavens themselves were intent on washing away the blood that would soon stain the decks. "Captain," Talon Graves shouted over the din of the chaos, his hand gripping the ship's wheel as he leaned toward Dorian. "They're firing again. We can't take many more of these hits." Dorian's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. Kerrigan's flagship was still in the lead, its massive ironclad frame glinting ominously in the gloom, its cannons roaring again. The Tempest's fury was smaller, faster, but it was outnumbered, and the ironclads were formidable. "We fight back, Talon. Ready the crew. Get the cannons loaded." Dorian barked, his voice filled with both resolve and command. "We'll outmaneuver them, but we need to be quicker." With a fierce nod, Talon vanished into the chaos of the deck, shouting orders to the crew. Ronan Dreven, the quartermaster, appeared at Dorian's side, his face grim but focused. "They'll expect us to turn and flee, Captain. But we're not running. We strike back, take them by surprise." Dorian's lips twisted into a feral grin, his eyes wild with the thrill of the fight. "No running, Ronan. We show them the fury of the deep." The Tempest's fury swerved violently, the crew shouting as they adjusted the sails to catch the fierce winds. The ship's cannons roared in response, sending blasts of fire and fury toward Kerrigan's fleet. The battle was chaos, ships plowing through the waves, cannons blazing, pirates fighting tooth and nail against the enemy. But in the midst of it all, Dorian's thoughts were drawn to Seraphine, to the mermaid locked below deck. The song of the sea had grown louder, like a whispering tide in his mind. It wasn't just a song. It was a call. The pull of the ocean was undeniable, and Seraphine's presence was stronger than ever. Dorian's eyes flickered toward the brig where she was being held. There was no time to free her, not yet. But he could feel her, just beneath the surface of the chaos, her strength as potent as the storm itself. She was a part of him now, and he could sense that she had been preparing for this moment as much as he had. The battle raged on. Kerrigan's ships closed in, cannons firing relentlessly, tearing holes into the Tempest's fury. The deck was slick with rain and blood, and the smell of salt and gunpowder filled the air. Pirates screamed, charging into the fray, swords raised high, clashing with Kerrigan's soldiers. But Dorian stood firm, his eyes locked on the horizon. The Tempest's fury could only take so much. The ship's hull had already been damaged, and the crew was weary, but Dorian refused to give in. He had made a promise. He would protect them. Protect Seraphine, no matter the cost. Talon appeared once more at his side, panting from the battle. We've lost the forward cannons, Captain. The enemy is closing in too fast. Dorian gritted his teeth. There was no time left for strategy. The only thing they could do now was fight. Fight with everything they had. Brace for impact. Dorian shouted, his voice echoing across the deck. We'll turn into them. We show Kerrigan what it means to fight with the fury of the sea. With a roar, the crew scrambled, pulling on ropes, adjusting sails, and getting ready to face the oncoming battle head-on. The Tempest's fury lurched to the side, turning into the oncoming ships, cannons blazing as it did. It was a risky maneuver, but it was the only chance they had. The clash of steel, the blast of cannons, and the cries of battle filled the air as the two ships collided. The sound was deafening, but Dorian's heart beat with purpose. He was no longer just a pirate captain. He was the storm, the fury of the deep, and he would not be swept aside. And then, in the midst of the chaos, he heard it again, the song. Seraphine's song. It wasn't just a call to the sea anymore. It was a call to him. In the heart of the battle, with the sky dark above, and the storm closing in, Dorian knew what he had to do. He turned toward the brig once more, his gaze unyielding. The time had come. The sea was his ally, and with Seraphine at his side, he would fight until the very waves swallowed them whole. The roar of battle still raged, deafening and relentless. The Tempest's fury rocked violently with every blast from Kerrigan's cannons, but Dorian Vane stood unmoving, his gaze locked on the enemy ships. There was no turning back now. This was the moment. The storm in his heart mirrored the storm on the sea. Captain, we're surrounded. Talon's voice shouted above the cacophony, his face drawn and desperate. He had fought through the chaos to reach Dorian's side, his eyes scanning the water for any hope of escape. Dorian didn't look away from the horizon. His hands gripped the wheel tight, his knuckles white against the rough wood. The Tempest's fury had taken too much damage. The ship groaned under the weight of the battle, but it refused to break. It was as alive as he was, and Dorian wouldn't let it fall, not while he still had breath. "Then we give them hell," Dorian growled, his voice low but filled with resolve. He turned to Talon, his eyes burning with determination. "We fight until the sea swallows us whole." Talon hesitated for a heartbeat before nodding. "Aye, Captain." The wind howled, and the sea thundered beneath them, as if the world itself was urging them forward. The enemy ships closed in, cannons roaring, their massive ironclads a formidable wall of destruction. Dorian knew they couldn't outlast the bombardment much longer, but there was one chance, a single desperate chance to turn the tide. He spun toward the brig, his heart pounding in his chest. Seraphine, her presence was like a fire in his soul, a burning need he couldn't ignore. The Mermaid's song had called to him before, pulling at the very fabric of his being. She was more than just a prisoner below deck. She was his hope. She was the key. "Ronan!" Dorian shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. The quartermaster appeared at his side, breathless, his expression hard. "Get to the brig. Free her." Ronan's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Captain, you've gone mad. The ship is sinking. The enemy's closing in." "I know," Dorian interrupted, his voice cold but unwavering. "But we fight with everything we've got, or we die trying. And I won't die until I've seen her free. Now go." Ronan didn't hesitate a moment longer. With a sharp nod, he disappeared below deck, leaving Dorian standing at the helm, the weight of his decision crashing down on him. The battle was slipping from their grasp, but there was still a glimmer of something deep within the ocean itself that called to him. As Dorian turned back to face the oncoming ships, a flicker of movement caught his eye. Seraphine. She was there, at the edge of the deck, her form a silken blur against the crashing waves. She had slipped free from her cage, her long silver tail trailing behind her as she emerged from the depths. Her hair, black as the sea at midnight, shimmered with an otherworldly glow, and her eyes, those eyes, locked with his, filled with something he could barely comprehend. Dorian's breath caught in his throat. Her song rang out, clear and beautiful even over the roar of battle, and it was like the sea itself answered her call. The wind shifted, the tide began to turn. The ocean was alive, responding to Seraphane's power. "Seraphane," Dorian whispered, his voice hoarse. She stepped forward, her bare feet moving like a dream across the wet deck, and her voice echoed through his mind, soft but firm. "The storm answers, Dorian Vane. The sea will fight for you, if you fight for it." A flash of understanding passed between them, deep and unspoken. She was not just a creature of the water. She was the water itself, and with her by his side, they could fight the storm and whatever lay beyond it. The enemy ships were nearly upon them now, the air thick with smoke and salt. Dorian's heart raced as he turned back to face his crew. The battle was slipping into chaos, but he had a new weapon. Seraphane, the mermaid of legend, was no longer a prisoner. She was their ally. "We fight together," Dorian shouted, his voice booming above the storm. "Take heart, men. The sea is with us." Kerrigan's fleet recoiled, their ships shaking under the force of the waves, their cannons firing wildly as they tried to maintain their position. But they were no match for the fury of the sea. Dorian stood tall, his heart pounding in his chest, and watched as the water swirled around them, the storm growing ever stronger. The tempest's fury surged forward, its sails full, as if the very wind itself had joined the fight. Seraphane stood beside him, her presence like a tidal wave, unstoppable and fierce. Her hair whipped around her face, her eyes locked onto the horizon with a fierce determination. Together, they were no longer just a pirate and a mermaid. They were the storm, and nothing would stand in their way. The battle was far from over, but now the tide had turned. And Dorian knew, deep in his bones, that they would emerge victorious, or they would drown trying. The battle raged on as the storm reached its peak. Kerrigan's fleet, battered by the fury of the sea and the relentless attacks of the tempest's fury, was beginning to falter. The air was thick with smoke, and the sound of cannons and the clash of steel echoed across the waves. But the tide had changed, and Dorian Vane felt it deep within his soul. The sea was no longer an enemy. It was a powerful ally, fighting alongside them. Seraphane stood at Dorian's side, her presence as commanding as the ocean itself. Her silken black hair whipped around her, her ocean blue eyes glowing with an ethereal light. Her bare feet barely touched the deck, the tips of her tail skimming the surface of the water, as though she was part of it, one with the very essence of the sea. Her song still lingered in the air, like a pulse, guiding them through the storm. The tempest's fury surged forward, its cannons blazing, but it was the sea that dealt the final blow. Giant waves rose from the depths, crashing against the enemy ships with the power of 1,000 storms. Kerrigan's fleet struggled to maintain its position, but the relentless pressure of the water soon became too much. One by one, the ships faltered, their hulls creaking and groaning under the weight of the ocean's wrath. "Captain," Talon shouted, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. "We've done it. The fleet's breaking apart." Dorian's heart thundered in his chest as he looked across the battlefield. Kerrigan's ships were sinking, their masts broken, their sails torn. The pirates aboard the Tempest's fury cheered, their voices rising in triumph, but Dorian didn't join in. His eyes were locked on Seraphane, whose gaze had softened, as though she felt the weight of their victory. The storm, which had once raged with unrelenting fury, now began to quiet. The waves slowly subsided, and the winds died down, leaving only the sound of the rain as it fell softly on the deck. The sun, which had been hidden behind the dark clouds, now began to break through, casting a warm golden light across the scene. The battle was over, but Dorian felt as though something greater had been accomplished. The sea had been tamed, if only for a moment, and he had won something more precious than treasure. Seraphine stepped closer to him, her eyes meeting his with a tenderness that took his breath away. Her voice, soft and melodic, reached his ears like a whisper carried on the wind. "We are not enemies, Dorian. The sea brought us together. It has chosen us." Dorian's chest tightened as her words settled in his heart. He had known from the moment he had met her that there was something special about her, something beyond the depths of the ocean. She was not just a mermaid, a creature of legend. She was something more, a force of nature, a reminder of the power of the world they sailed upon. "I don't know what comes next," Dorian said, his voice thick with emotion. "But with you, I know we can face whatever the sea throws at us." Seraphine smiled, her lips curving in a way that sent a thrill through Dorian's heart. She reached out, her fingers brushing his, the touch sending a spark of warmth through him. "Then we face it together." Dorian looked around him. The battle was over, but there was still work to be done. The Tempest's fury had taken heavy damage, and the crew was weary. But they had won. The fleet was destroyed, Kerrigan was defeated, and the sea, his true ally, had stood by them. Ronan came to Dorian's side, his face tired but triumphant. "Captain, we've done it. The crew's been rallied, and we've taken the fight to them. But what of the rest of Kerrigan's fleet? There are more ships out there." Dorian nodded, his gaze still locked on Seraphine. "There will always be more ships, Ronan, but we'll face them when the time comes." The ocean was calm now, its waves lapping gently against the sides of the ship. The sky above was clearing, the storm's fury now a distant memory. But Dorian knew this peace wouldn't last forever. There would always be more battles, more challenges to face. But for now, they had won. And for the first time in his life, Dorian felt like he wasn't alone. He had Seraphine, his mermaid, his ally, his love, and the ocean itself as his companion. Together, they were unstoppable. Dorian turned to her, his eyes filled with a quiet certainty. "The sea may never be truly tame, but as long as we sail together, we'll weather whatever storms come our way." Seraphine smiled softly, her eyes glowing with an ancient, untamed light. "Then we sail, Captain, together." And so, with the sun rising in the distance, the Tempest's fury set sail once again, its black sails catching the wind, carrying them toward the unknown. But with Seraphine by his side, and the ocean's power at his back, Dorian knew that no matter what awaited them on the horizon, they would face it with courage, with love, and with the strength of the sea itself.